So we're talking about mixing, and Mix with the Masters is a very special group where you can come and sit in and watch people, the pros, work on the consoles and see what their strategies are, and perhaps to help you with your own mixing strategies. A lot of times we're working on large format consoles, which may be unnecessary for everybody these days. So I've gone from the big large format console all the way into mixing in the box personally on ProTools, and I love working on the large format console. I've been mixing on flying faders forever, but it became necessary for me to go into the box because trying to do recalls on the large format console was really difficult. A lot of times I'd be working with a client who doesn't live in town with me. I live in Oregon these days. I live in the woods, so sometimes people would come up and hang out while I'm mixing. Most of the time I'm getting sent files from long distance, and I'll load them into the computer, and then I'll mix them on the big desk. But when I finish a mix and send it to the client, it might take days before they get back with me with notes, and in the meantime that console is tied up, losing money, right? Losing clientele. So we decided to go all the way in the box, and we set up a really outrageously nice Pro Tools mix rig and loaded it with all kinds of plugins, including the UA package, the Waves package, Isotope, Slate, Melodyne, Sound Toys, Valhalla. Oh, the list goes on. There's some great plugins, and I've managed to learn how to work in the box with similar results to working on an analog desk. However, on this latest project that I worked on, it's a band called Turbo Negro, and they're from Norway, and they flew me over to work on in a studio there that had a vintage Neve, much like the one I have, and I thought, well, I'll prep all the sessions on my mix rig, but I'll prep it to have stems output instead of having everything in the mixed out of two tracks, two channels. So I had stems, and then I brought them up on the Neve there in Oslo, and so I did a kind of a hybrid mix, and I realized this is a great way to work if you have access to a large format console and you're worried about being able to do recalls. This is the way you want to do it, because you get all the advantages of being in the box and the ability to recall easily, but you get that nice analog juicy sound that you're missing when you're working entirely in the box. So this is one of the tracks from Turbo Negro. It's a fun song. It's called Powder Ballad, and the chorus lyric goes, "You've got the powder, I've got the gun." I think it's a play on 80s rock. So they went for the whole 80s thing, and when I mixed it, I added a gated snare, reverb, and everything. I mean, it's full on 80s, right? So it's a lot of fun. But let me just show you how I have this mix set up, and this beautiful duality here. It's a fantastic console. But I'm only using the first, what do I got here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 16. First 16 channels. The rest of them, I could just pull them all down here. And the first 16 channels basically are stems. They're the drum stem, which is left and right, bass stem, instrument 1, which I believe is guitar, instrument 2, which is another set of guitars, instrument 3, instrument 4. I'll check and see in the session how I have that set up. But then we have lead vocals and backing vocals, and they're all stems. They're set up left and right. I believe Instrument 1 would have been panned all left. Instrument 2 all right. I hope I'm doing that right. And we'll see what we have. I haven't even played this yet, so I hope it works. Let's see. Don't want to blast anyone out. I'm turning this all the way down. And I think we're parked in the right spot. There we go. Alright, let's see what we got. Oh, thank you. Oh yeah. Anyway, wow, right? 80s all the way. I think we're going back to the 80s now. What I noticed about this mix, and the demonstration here is that this song was already mixed on an entirely different analog console in Oslo. Yet I'm able to bring it up here on this desk, and I haven't even heard this since the mix that I did in Oslo. And you're able to bring it back with basically just these stems on the desk. And now I can continue to work on it. If I was going to recall this mix at this point, I would adjust a few things. I noticed that the snare was very loud, and I know exactly what that is. When I set up mixes in my Pro Tools session, I use a template, and I'm not sure how popular that is to use a template. Maybe everybody uses a template, right? But I've set up my own template. I have a very specific template, and I'll describe it here for you, and I'll show you. All the yellow tracks are drums, and then all those drums are summed through bus 1 and 2 into a drum sum, which you can see here, part of my template. The template is the pink labeled tracks here. Drum sum 1 and 2. And then I, within those drum tracks, have sends here that go to various effects, also part of my template. And all those templates, all the effects are set up within the template. So basically I just plug everything in and it goes. One thing I do with the drums, and the kick and snare in particular, is I do side chain compression, and I call it a spank. And so I'll send the kick and snare tracks, and you'll see that here. Kick and snare is being sent through, I believe, this send 4344 bus. It's a bus 4344, and then that bus is here within my template on the drum spank 4344. The plugin that I'm using there in this session, particularly today, is an MV2. This is the simplest waves compressor. I mean, it's so simple. There's like two adjustments on it, basically, and an output. So, but what that does, and I'll get this going here so you can see it work, is it's just handling the kick and snare, and it's going to add a little snap, or spank, I call it. And since that snare is loud, I'm just going to bring that back. did something, I think. I'm gonna adjust I'm going to also adjust the send into that spank. I think it needs a little more control. I want more kick and less snare. Let's see what that does. Is that also 43, 44? Yeah. All right. I also add a trigger to most rock kick and snare just to give it a little extra oomph. And I use a plug-in. Generally I'll use the Slate trigger, the Trigger 2. It's a Stephen Slate trigger plug-in, which is great. And then I add my own samples, and sometimes I'll take a sample of the actual snare track that's provided in the session. I'll just cut one of those snare hits out, and then I'll put it into the trigger and add that too, because it'll add a consistency to the live drums. So that's my little snare spank. That's my drum spank. The other stuff that I'll use in my drum template will be an extra sub, and I'll add the kick drum into the sub. So I'm adding these effects, and then those effects also get summed through the bus into the drum sum. So my sub, I'm using a low air, which is also a Waves plugin. Sometimes I use what else do I use for that? There's a couple other subharmonic programs that I really like, the plugins, but the low air is pretty easy to use. Sometimes I'll use Waves reverb. A lot of times I'll use Valhalla. The vintage reverbs by Valhalla plugins are great. I think I'm loaded up with the Waves here because I'm doing a demonstration over at Waves, I think tomorrow. So anyway, this session is loaded with Waves today. But on my sum, I'm using a Quickchild. Sometimes I'll use Stephen Slate's mastering compression. So I take everything that I'll take all the drums that I have in the session, and I'll put them through a compressor just to get some control over it. So next in my template, I've got the bass tracks, and then the bass also goes through a bass sum. And on the bass sum, I'm going to use a compressor, and I like this Jack Joseph Puig bass processor. It's got sub, it's got width, so I can really get a good sound with that. So what you'll see that I do a lot of is I'll use a lot less plugins because I'm summing everything into submixes, and then I'm treating the submix before I treat the individual tracks. I just think the more plugins you pile on, the thinner and more flat everything sounds, just kind of two-dimensional. So I like to keep all the tracks as open as possible with as few plugins on the tracks as possible, and just affect the sum. So you'll see the bass. Sometimes I'll use a little bit of a Sans Amp plugin on the bass DI, and sometimes I'll put a little EQ on the bass tracks just in case it needs a little extra emphasis. But most of the heavy lifting will be done on the sums, and that goes with guitar too. On guitar, you'll see this guitar here, these are all one player, so I group them all into one sum, and there's no EQ on the individual tracks at all, but I have an EQ on the overall for this guitar. I have an EQ on the sum for basically this instrument, and that is, I love the 560 emulations. Both the Waves and the UA emulations are great for that. So then on down the road, we've got this other guitar player. Same thing, no individual EQ, no plugins, no sends. But on the sum, I will put plugin. This one is frozen just for this demonstration, but it's a API 560 emulation. Then we've got a solo here, and that solo is going to its own sum, instrument 3. And the same thing happens there. There's no EQ on the individual tracks, but there is EQ and compression on the sum. And same with the keys, the cheesy keys. Actually, I did have to work harder on those keys. I didn't record this project, so I had to spend extra time and extra effort to get these keys to actually sound rich and full. So I put a lot of extra work into making this sound good, and because of that I had to add some more individual EQ to the tracks. But then at the end of that I did also have an overall, what one was that? It was a compressor, a 670 UA, the UA Fairchild emulation. Lead vocal is something that sometimes takes more work. This one was actually recorded really well. Again, very little plug-in activity on the individual tracks, but I do a lot of work in the template on the sums for the vocals to make them sound good. And that is here, I'm using an overall EQ on everything, not on the individual tracks, but on everything. And then I'll use a compressor overall also. A lot of times I'll also use the Slate virtual mix rack, which I love because I can use there's like a black face, the FG16, the compressor module, and then I'll use the blue kind of British EQ, and I'll put that on the vocals, and that takes the place of what I have here, which is, you know, the same thing, EQ and compression. So the Slate stuff is very good for this too. And then backing vocals, same thing. The other things I'll do to the vocals within the template is I use a widener, and this is where I use a Sound Toys micro pitch plug-in to create a really wide, you know, because your vocals sometimes they're panned in the middle, they're very small, but if you want to make them bigger, then I'll add this widener to give it more of a panorama. And the same thing goes with, let's see, I'll add FX, and I'll keep the reverb and the delay separate from each other usually. My favorite delay actually is a UA Cooper time cube, because I've used the actual time cube before, and I actually have one. The UA version is really nothing like the original, because the original had very short time delays, but the new one you can have very long delays. I just like the controls of it, and it gets I get to where I want quickly with it. But another alternate is this. Is the Waves Manny delay, and I call it within my template, I call it the cube, because usually it's the time cube, so that's why that says cube. The vocal reverb is usually separate, and again, each sum has its own effects. So if I'm putting an effect on a guitar, I don't share effects. Like I don't put the vocals and the guitar through the same reverb, because this becomes very hard to control. So I'll keep those separate. And then finally the vocals get the same kind of treatment. But I find that if I compress the vocals separate from each other, say the lead vocals and the backing vocals, if they're separate from each other in compressing, it's much easier to separate them when you're hearing it. So I keep everything separate, and then ultimately when I'm mixing in the box, all these sums get summed into the master and then recorded on a final mix track. These are muted now because I'm using a hybrid approach, so everything comes up on the desk. That way, typically in the box I'll use a stereo bus, EQ and compression, but since we're working on this hybrid, approach, I can use the compression on the desk here, which is fantastic. The SSL bus compressor is one of my favorites. So the other great thing about doing the hybrid approach, so now all those sums in my template all come out to these individual pairs of tracks on the desk. So if I want to do an overall EQ on all the drums, I can do a little additional EQ here. And I can do a little additional on the bass here. And I'm going to actually try some of that. Let's see, what does it really need though? I think that for some reason I'm not getting enough bass and a kick drum on our mix here now. It sounds a lot less exciting than it did when I finished the mix originally. So let me just try to adjust that now, if you'll give me a minute. Thanks. All right, let's work on the bass now. Nothing like mixing in an airport or when it's like, you know, with a jet engine right there, but I think that sounds better. Let me work on guitars a little bit. I'll just go through each of the stems on the desk and then we'll see if we've made it better or not. All right.